In 1932, a man named Earl Tupper was working at a DuPont chemical factory for $35 a week. His co-workers thought he was strange. His neighbors thought he was delusional. His own family quietly worried about him, because while everyone around him was cutting back, selling off their last possessions, standing in bread lines stretching 3 city blocks, Earl was pouring every spare cent he had into a bizarre little hobby, experimenting with leftover plastic slag from the factory floor, trying to figure out if he could make something useful out of the black, greasy waste material that everyone else just threw away. People laughed at him. Not behind his back, to his face. One foreman told him directly, "Earl, the whole country is collapsing and you're playing with garbage." He kept going anyway. Within 15 years, Tupperware had become one of the most recognized brands in American history, and Earl Tupper was worth more money than that foreman would earn in 100 lifetimes. But Earl wasn't the only one. During the darkest economic collapse America had ever seen, when unemployment hit 25%, when banks failed by the thousands, when grown men wept on street corners because they couldn't feed their children, a small group of individuals started businesses that everyone around them mocked, dismissed, and called foolish. These weren't lucky accidents. These were deliberate, calculated decisions made by people who understood something their neighbors didn't. And today, we're going to go through all 20 of them. Some of these will surprise you. A few will genuinely shock you. And at least one of them is something you probably used this week without ever knowing it was born from desperation in 1931. Before we get into it, if you're new here and you like stories about the kind of wisdom that actually changes how you see the world, hit subscribe. We put out new videos every week and I don't want you to miss what's coming. Number 20 is going to set the tone for everything else on this list. Number 20. The Man Who Sold Dirt. In 1931, a farmer in rural Georgia named Thomas Harlan did something that caused his entire community to openly question his sanity. The bank had just foreclosed on half the farms in his county. Crops were worthless because nobody had money to buy food at market prices. Thomas looked at his depleted, exhausted soil, and instead of seeing failure, he saw a product. He began selling what he called rebuilt earth, carefully composted, nutrient-dense soil that he mixed by hand and sold in burlap sacks to the small number of city families who had started growing victory gardens to survive the Depression. His neighbors laughed until their sides hurt. "You're going to sell dirt to city people?" "Dirt?" Thomas didn't argue with them. He just kept mixing compost, kept perfecting his ratios of manure to leaf matter to wood ash, kept refining his product until it was genuinely extraordinary. By 1935, he had 4 employees. By 1938, he was shipping across 3 states. The bagged soil and amendment industry he helped pioneer is worth billions of dollars today, and it all started because a man in Georgia refused to be embarrassed by what he had. Number 19. The seamstress who charged more during the Depression. Everyone told Margaret Hollis she was going to starve. She was a seamstress in Chicago, and when the Depression hit, every other tailor and seamstress in her neighborhood immediately dropped their prices to compete for the shrinking pool of customers who still had any money. Margaret did the opposite. She raised her prices and narrowed her focus exclusively to alterations and repairs. Her reasoning was simple, and her neighbors thought it was insane. She believed that wealthy people still had money, they still needed their clothes maintained, and they would pay a premium for work done with absolute precision. She was right. While her competitors fought over $0.25 jobs, Margaret was charging $3 to $5 for impeccable work that the city's remaining wealthy families trusted completely. She never went hungry. She hired 2 assistants by 1934. Her shop stayed open through the entire Depression while every competitor around her closed. Number 18. The Radio Repairman. Everyone pitied. In 1930, Frank DeLuca opened a radio repair shop in Cleveland, and everyone in his family thought it was an act of desperation, the last resort of a man with no other options. Radios were already in over 12 million American homes, and as families lost everything, the radio became the last luxury they refused to surrender. They would sell furniture. They would go without heat. But they kept their radio. Frank understood this with crystalline clarity. He charged fair prices, worked 7 days a week, and within 2 years, his shop was the busiest repair operation in his district. He had a 6-week backlog. What looked like a desperate gamble was actually one of the most psychologically astute business decisions of the era. He had correctly identified the one product Americans would sacrifice nearly anything to keep. Number 17. The barber who opened when everyone said to wait. Samuel Okafor had saved $400 over 4 years of working in someone else's barbershop. In 1930, his family begged him not to spend it. Every financial advisor of the era was telling people to hold cash, wait for stability, let the crisis pass. Samuel did not wait. He signed a lease on a tiny shop, bought used equipment, and opened his doors. His reasoning: men still needed haircuts. Men always needed haircuts. It didn't matter how poor you were. At some point, you needed to look presentable for a job interview, for church, for a funeral. And Samuel charged 15 cents when competing shops were charging 25. He was packed every single day. By 1936, he owned the building. Number 16. The woman who made soap from scraps. In rural Tennessee, Clara Watts had been making soap at home for her family the way her grandmother taught her. Wood ash lye, rendered fat from butchering, a little lard from the smokehouse. When her husband lost his factory job in 1931, Clara started selling her soap at the county market. People expected to haggle her down. Instead, Clara's soap was so dramatically better than commercial products, which had become thin, watery, and cheap as companies cut costs, that women started coming from neighboring counties specifically to buy from her. She never advertised. She didn't need to. Within 3 years, she was producing soap full-time in a purpose-built outbuilding on her property, employing her 3 sisters and 2 neighbors, and selling to general stores across 4 counties. Number 15. The cobbler who became indispensable. New shoes were a luxury nobody could afford in the Depression. But your existing shoes falling apart wasn't optional. You needed shoes to work, to walk, to survive a northern winter. Leon Przybylski was a cobbler in Detroit who had the foresight in 1929, just before the crash, to stock up on leather, nails, thread, and resoling materials at pre-crash prices. When the economy collapsed, he had inventory that would have cost him 3 times as much to replace. He could undercut everyone and still make a healthy margin. His shop ran 3 shifts. He taught his teenage sons and 2 nephews the trade. The Przybylski family cobbling operation became one of the most financially stable small businesses in their neighborhood for the entire duration of the Depression, and it was built entirely on the insight that people fix what they can't afford to replace. Number 14. The ice cream man in the middle of a crisis. Theodore Bingham opened a small ice cream cart operation in Philadelphia in 1931, and people genuinely thought he had lost his mind. Ice cream? During the Depression? Theodore had a different theory about human psychology. He believed, and he turned out to be completely correct, that people who are suffering desperately need small, affordable pleasures. A penny ice cream was not a luxury. It was a survival mechanism for the soul. Mothers who couldn't afford meat for dinner could still buy their child a penny ice cream on a hot summer afternoon and feel, for one moment, like the world wasn't completely broken. Theodore's cart operation expanded to 4 carts by 1933, 7 by 1935. He understood that joy is not a luxury, it is a necessity, and people will find the penny for it. Number 13. The seeds merchant who sold hope. Nobody in the agricultural business thought selling seeds in 1931 was a good idea. Farmers were ruined. Commodity prices had collapsed. The entire agricultural economy seemed finished. A man named Howard Gable disagreed. Howard saw what the government's relief programs were slowly realizing. The only sustainable solution to hunger was for people to grow their own food. He began stocking and selling vegetable seeds specifically suited to small plots, backyard gardens, vacant lots, narrow strips of city land. He wrote simple planting guides himself and included them free with every purchase. He gave away seeds to families who genuinely couldn't pay, betting on future goodwill. That bet paid off. Families who received seeds from Howard became his most loyal customers when they could afford to pay. His business survived the Depression without a single year of loss. If you're watching this and you've ever grown food from seed, Take a moment to think about men like Howard Gable who kept that knowledge and those traditions alive when the entire system was falling apart. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because what's coming up in the top 10 gets genuinely extraordinary. Number 12. The laundry woman who automated at the worst possible time. Everyone thought Ruth Simmons was deranged when she spent her savings in 1932 on a commercial washing machine for her laundry service. A machine? When people were starving? But Ruth had done her math carefully. The machine meant she could process 3 times the laundry in the same hours. The hotels and boarding houses that still operated, and some still did, serving traveling salesmen and the working poor, needed clean linens reliably and cheaply. Ruth could underbid every hand-washing competitor in her district and still clear a better profit than she'd made before. The machine paid for itself in 8 months. Ruth never looked back. Number 11. The funeral director who offered payment plans. This one sounds grim, and it is, but it's also one of the most quietly revolutionary small business innovations of the Depression era. Mortician James Whitfield was watching families destroyed not just by grief, but by the impossible financial burden of burying their loved ones with dignity. He began offering structured payment plans, small weekly amounts spread over months, at a time when every other mortuary in his city demanded full payment up front or offered only the most basic pauper's burial. The gratitude families felt toward James was profound and lasting. They sent everyone they knew to him. They sent their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers. His business became one of the most trusted institutions in his community. He never became fabulously wealthy, but he never suffered either, and he died knowing he had given hundreds of families something priceless, the dignity of a proper farewell to the people they loved. Number 10. The man who bottled spring water and got laughed out of every room. In 1933, Charles Morrison was trying to convince investors, such as they were in 1933, that people would pay money for bottled water. The response was universal derision. You want to charge people for water? For water? People will never pay for water when they can get it from a tap. Charles spent a decade being patient. He was selling to hotels, to hospitals, to businesses that served the public and needed reliable, clean water independent of aging city infrastructure. He wasn't trying to sell water to individuals yet. He was building supply chains, distribution relationships, and a reputation for consistency. The bottled water industry he helped build eventually became one of the most profitable segments in the entire beverage market. The people who laughed at Charles in 1933 were not wrong about what the world looked like then. They were wrong about what the world was going to become. Number 9. The typing school that ran through the night. Clara Fontaine opened a typing school in New York in 1932 using 2 rented typewriters and a folding table in her apartment living room. People thought it was a hobby at best, a waste of money at worst. But Clara understood the job market in a way most people didn't. Companies were laying off workers by the thousands, but the workers who kept their jobs, or found new ones, were increasingly the ones with specific, demonstrable skills. Typing was one of those skills. She ran morning classes, afternoon classes, and evening classes 7 days a week. She charged $3 for a 2-week course. She had a waiting list within 6 months. By 1936, she had rented a proper commercial space and owned 8 typewriters. Clara Fontaine trained over 2,000 people during the Depression years alone, and many of those people credited her classes with giving them the edge they needed to survive. Number 8. The photographer who shot portraits. When no one had money for portraits, Marcus Webb was a photographer in Memphis who started offering depression portraits, dignified, professional photographs of families taken in their homes, at a price point ordinary people could reach. He charged $1 for 2 prints. People told him he was foolish. Nobody has $1 for photographs right now. Marcus knew something those people didn't. The Depression was destroying families. People were separating, moving, dying young from stress and inadequate health care. Families sensed, correctly, that time was short and uncertain, and they wanted proof that they had existed, that they had been together, that they had mattered. Marcus was booked every weekend for years. He understood that the impulse to be remembered is not a luxury. It is one of the most fundamental human needs there is. Number 7. The mechanic who fixed anything for half price. When Robert Vance opened his repair shop in Kansas City in 1931, he didn't specialize. He fixed cars, farm equipment, sewing machines, refrigerators, furnaces, anything mechanical that someone brought through his door. His prices were exactly half what the established shops in town charged. Everyone thought he was undercutting himself into poverty. Robert understood that volume and loyalty would make up the difference. He was right. Within 2 years, his shop was running from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. He trained apprentices from the neighborhood, paying them small wages while teaching them skills they would use for the rest of their lives. His shop was a community institution. When he finally retired in 1962, 3 of those apprentices had opened their own successful shops, all of them crediting Robert with everything they knew. Tell me in the comments, do you know a business story from your own family's history during the Depression? I read every single comment and I want to hear it. Number 6. The woman who taught cooking classes in her kitchen. Edith Morales had been the best cook in her neighborhood for as long as anyone could remember. When her husband lost his job in 1930, her sister suggested she charge neighbors to teach them to cook. Edith thought it was absurd. Who pays for cooking lessons? Her sister talked her into it anyway. Edith's first class had 4 women. She charged 25 cents and taught them how to make 5 complete meals from the cheapest available ingredients: dried beans, cornmeal, seasonal vegetables, small cuts of tough meat made tender through slow cooking. Word spread instantly. Within 3 months, Edith was running 6 classes a week with 12 students each. She had turned her kitchen into a small commercial operation, her dining room into a classroom, and her knowledge into income. What she was selling wasn't cooking. It was confidence, and the ability to feed a family well despite everything. Number 5. The man who repaired watches, when watches were the only clock people had. Jerome Calloway set up a watch repair bench in the front window of his house in Baltimore in 1930. People paid attention to his location. Front window, visible from the street, because Jerome had thought carefully about advertising. He couldn't afford signs, but he could sit where people walking by could see him working, see the care and precision he brought to each piece, see a craftsman taking the time to do something right. Pocket watches and wristwatches were often the only timepieces working families owned. They needed them for work. Jerome repaired watches for $0, $50 when the going rate was $1, $50 at jewelry stores. He had more work than he could handle within weeks. He trained his daughter, then his son, then his nephew. The Calloway watch repair operation ran profitably for 31 years. Number 4. The small press that published practical knowledge. In 1931, a man named George Aldrich began printing and selling small booklets, 20 to 40 pages each, on practical subjects: how to preserve vegetables, how to repair leather goods, how to build a root cellar, how to treat common illnesses with available herbs, how to stretch $1's worth of meat into a week of meals. He printed them on a hand press in his garage. He sold them for 5 cents each at markets, hardware stores, and general merchants. People bought them ravenously. Practical knowledge that helped them survive was not a luxury. It was one of the most valuable things in the world. George sold over 40 Zusammen individual booklets in his first 2 years. He could barely keep up with demand. What he was really selling was agency, the feeling that you could take care of yourself and your family regardless of what the economy did. Number 3. The herbalist who blended remedies when doctors were unaffordable. Dorothy Sloan had learned herbal medicine from her Cherokee grandmother, and in 1932 she began selling carefully formulated tinctures, teas, and salves at the farmers market in Asheville, North Carolina. Doctor visits were completely out of reach for most families. Dorothy charged 10 cents for remedies that genuinely worked: elderberry preparations for chest congestion, chamomile and valerian blends for the anxiety and sleeplessness that were epidemic in Depression-era families, comfrey salves for skin wounds and joint pain. She was not a fraud, and she made no wild claims. She told people what each remedy was for, what it contained, and what to expect. Her reputation for honesty and effectiveness spread so rapidly that by 1935 she had a small shop, a mail-order catalog, and customers in 6 states, Dorothy Sloan represents something important that gets lost in our modern story about the Depression: community resilience. The people who made it through were often the ones who had preserved old knowledge that industrial society had tried to make obsolete. Number 2. The man who made furniture from salvaged wood. When Henry Beaumont started collecting discarded wood, broken pallets, demolition timber, storm-downed trees, and turning it into furniture in 1931, people in his Alabama town called him a scavenger. The word was not meant kindly. Henry kept scavenging. He built tables, chairs, shelves, and cabinets from wood that cost him nothing but time. He sold them for half what new furniture cost, and they were, many of his customers noted, built better than anything they'd bought at a store. He had no waste. Every scrap became something: kindling sold by the bundle, sawdust sold to butcher shops for their floors, shavings sold to farmers for bedding. Henry Beaumont had, almost accidentally, invented what we would now call circular manufacturing, a system where nothing is wasted. Everything becomes something else. And the margin comes not from charging more, but from spending less. His grandson still runs the family woodworking shop today. And now, number 1. The story that I've saved for last because it contains, I think, the single most important lesson of this entire list, and the most complete example of what it actually looks like to build lasting wealth from genuine hardship. His name was Arthur Doyle, not the author, a different man entirely. And he was a traveling knife sharpener in rural Ohio in 1930. He owned a bicycle, a sharpening wheel mounted to the frame, and a hand-painted sign that he tied to his handlebars: "Sharpen your life, 5 cents." People in his town laughed at him openly. A knife sharpener on a bicycle. That was work for immigrants fresh off the boat, for drifters, for men who had no other options. Arthur had other options. He had been a sales manager at a hardware company before it folded. He had a college education. He spoke 3 languages. He chose the bicycle deliberately. He had calculated that every home in America had at least 4 knives that needed sharpening at least twice a year. In rural Ohio alone, within a 40-mile riding radius, there were approximately 3 Suazaran households. If he could reach each one twice a year, charge 5 cents per knife, average 3 knives per household, that was $900 a year, significantly more than most Depression-era workers were earning. He was right, but what Arthur discovered on those daily routes was something he hadn't calculated. He discovered that people were extraordinarily lonely. The Depression had fractured communities. Men were away looking for work. Women were isolated, anxious, and exhausted. When Arthur arrived on his bicycle, he didn't just sharpen knives. He talked. He listened. He carried news from house to house. Not gossip, not scandal, but genuine information. Which families were doing relatively well and might have work to offer? Which farmers were selling off equipment cheaply? Who had extra vegetables to trade? Who was looking to hire? He became a one-man community network in an era before telecommunications had reached rural households. Families didn't just want their knives sharpened. They wanted Arthur to come back. They began saving up their dull knives specifically for his visits. They told every neighbor about him. They began requesting particular days and times. Within 3 years, Arthur had trained 8 other men on 8 bicycles, each working a different territory, each following his model of sharpening knives and building genuine human connection. He organized them into the first formal route-based service business in his county, kept 20% of each worker's earnings as a coordination and supply fee, and retired in 1941 with enough money invested in treasury bonds to live comfortably for the rest of his life. When a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch interviewed him in 1948 and asked what his secret was, Arthur said something that has stayed with me since I first read that interview. "I never tried to sell sharpened knives. I sold people back their own reliability. A man with a sharp knife can do his work. A woman with a sharp knife can feed her family. I was just the one who got there with the wheel." The reporter asked if he'd ever been embarrassed, riding around on that bicycle when he'd been a college-educated sales manager. Arthur laughed and said, "I was embarrassed the day I lost my job and didn't know what to do. After that, I was too busy to be embarrassed by anything. Here is what unites every single person on this list. And here is the thing I want you to sit with after this video ends. None of them were trying to get rich. Every single one of them started by solving a real problem for real people in their immediate community. Thomas Harlan improved soil because soil mattered. Clara Watts made better soap because people needed clean things. Arthur Doyle sharpened knives because dull knives were a practical obstacle to daily life. The wealth came after. It came because they solved real problems with genuine care. And genuine care is the rarest and most valuable thing in any economy, at any point in history. The people who laughed at them were not stupid. They were afraid, and fear makes you look for safety in what everyone else is doing. The people who built businesses during the Depression were also afraid. The difference is they put their fear to work. They ask themselves, what does someone actually need today? Not tomorrow, not in theory. Today, in this neighborhood, in this economy, from a person with these specific limited resources. And then they answered that question with everything they had. So here is my challenge to you. Look at whatever resources you have right now. Your skills, your time, your knowledge, what you have sitting in your home or your community. And ask yourself the same question Arthur Doyle asked in 1930. What does someone actually need today that I am uniquely able to provide? You may be surprised by what you find. If this video gave you something worth keeping, leave a comment below with one skill or resource from your own life that you think might be undervalued. I'm going to read every single one, and I'll see you in the next video.